I, Claudius, by Robert Graves. Chapter 9. His name was Polio, and I shall recall what the exact circumstances of our meeting, which took place just a week after my betrothal to Ergolanila. I was reading in the Apollo library when along came Livy and a little brisk old man in the robe of a senator. Livy was saying, "It seems, then, that we may as well abandon all hopes of finding it, unless perhaps... Why, there's Sulpicius! He'll know if anyone does. Good morning, Sulpicius. I want you to do a favor for Asinius Pollio and myself. There's a book we want to look at, a commentary by a Greek called Polymocles, on Polybius's military tactics. I seem to remember coming across it here once, but the catalogue does not mention it, and the librarians here are perfectly useless." Sulpicius gnawed his beard for a while, and then said, "You've got the name wrong. Polymocrates was the name, and he wasn't a Greek, in spite of his name, but a Jew. 15 years ago I remember seeing it on that top shelf, the fourth from the window, right at the back, and the title tag had just a dissertation on tactics on it. Let me get it for you. I don't expect it's been moved since then." Then Livy saw me. "Hello, my friend, how goes it? Do you know the famous Asinius Pollio?" I saluted them, and Pollio said, "What's that you're reading, boy?" "Trash, I'll be bound, by the shamefaced way you hide it. Young fellows nowadays read only trash." He turned to Livy. "I'll bet you 10 gold pieces that it's some wretched art of love or Arcadian pastoral nonsense or something of that sort." "I'll take the bet," said Livy. "Young Claudius is not that sort of young man at all. Well, Claudius, which of us wins?" I said, stammering, to Pollio, I'm glad to say, sir, that you lose." Pollio frowned angrily at me. "What's that you say? Glad that I lose, eh? Is that a proper way to speak to an old man like me, and a senator, too?" I said it in all respect, sir. I am glad that you lose. I should not like to hear this book called trash. It's your own history of the Civil Wars, and if I may venture to praise it, a very fine book indeed." Pollio's face changed. He beamed and chuckled, and pulled out his purse, pressing the coins on Livy. Livy, with whom he seemed on terms of friendly animosity, if you know what I mean, refused them with mock-serious insistence. "My dear Pollio, I couldn't possibly take your money. You were quite right. These young fellows nowadays read the most wretched stuff. Not another word, please. I agree that I've lost the bet. Here are 10 gold pieces of my own, and I'm glad to pay them." Pollio appealed to me. "Now, sir, I don't know who you are, but you seem to be a lad of sense. Have you read our friend Livy's work? I appeal to you. Isn't that at least trashier writing than mine?" I smiled. "Well, at least it's easier to read." "Easier, eh? How's that?" "He makes the people of ancient Rome behave and talk as if they were alive now." Pollio was delighted. "He has you there, Livy, on your weakest spot. You credit the Romans of 7 centuries ago with impossibly modern motives and habits and speeches. Yes, it's readable all right, but it's not history." Before I record more of this conversation, I must say a few words about old Pollio, perhaps the most gifted man of his day, not even excepting Augustus. He was now nearly 80 years old, but in full possession of his mental powers, and seemingly in better physical health than many a man of 60. He had crossed the Rubicon with Julius Caesar and fought with him against Pompey, and served under my grandfather Antony, before his quarrel with Augustus, and had been consul and governor of further Spain and of Lombardy, and had won a triumph for a victory in the Balkans, and had been a personal friend of Cicero's until he grew disgusted with him, and a patron of the poets, Virgil and Horace. Besides all this, he was a distinguished orator and writer of tragedies. But he was a better historian than he was either tragedian or orator, because he had a love of literal truth amounting to pedantry, which he could not square with the conventions of these other literary forms. With the spoils of the Balkan campaign, he had founded a public library, the first public library at Rome. There were now 2 others, the one we were in, and another called after my grandmother, Octavia, but Pollio's was much better organized for reading purposes than the other. Sulpicius had now found the book, and after a word of thanks to him, they renewed their argument. Livy said, "The trouble with Pollio is that when he writes history, he feels obliged to suppress all his finer, more poetical feelings, and make his characters behave with conscientious dullness, and when he puts a speech into their mouths, he denies them the least oratorical ability." Pollio said, "Yes, poetry is poetry, and oratory is oratory, and history is history, and you can't mix them." "Can't I?" "Indeed I can," said Livy. "Do you mean to say that I mustn't write history with an epic theme because that's prerogative of poetry? Or put worthy eve of battle speeches in the mouths of my generals because to compass such speeches is the prerogative of oratory?" "That is precisely what I do mean. History is a true record of what happened, how people lived and died, what they did and said. An epic theme merely distorts the records. As for your general speeches, they are admirable as oratory, but damnably unhistorical. Not only is there no particle of evidence for any one of them, but they are inappropriate. I have heard more eve of battle speeches than most men, and though the generals that made them, Caesar and Antony especially, were remarkably fine platform orators, they were all too good soldiers to try any platform business on the troops. They spoke to them in a conversational way. They did not orate. What sort of speech did Caesar make before the battle of Pharsalia? Did he beg us to remember our wives and children and the sacred temples of Rome and the glories of our past campaigns? By God, he didn't. He climbed up on the stump of a pine tree with one of those monster radishes in one hand and a lump of hard soldier's bread in the other, and joked between mouthfuls. Not dainty jokes, but the real stuff, told with the straightest face, about how chaste Pompey's life was compared with his own reprobate one. The things he did with that radish would have made an ox laugh. I remember one broad anecdote about how Pompey won his surname the Great. Oh, that radish! And another still worse one about how he himself had lost his hair in the bazaar at Alexandria. I'd tell you them both now, but for this boy here, and but for your being certain to miss the point, not having been educated in Caesar's camp. Not a word about the approaching battle except just at the close. Poor old Pompey, up against Julius Caesar and his men. What a chance he has. You didn't put any of this in your history, said Livy. Not in the public edition, said Pollio. I'm not a fool. Still, if you like to borrow the private supplement, which I have just finished writing, you'll find it there. But perhaps you'll never bother. I'll tell you the rest. Caesar was a wonderful mimic, and he gave them Pompey's dying speech preparatory to falling on his sword, the radish again, with the end bitten off. He rallied in Pompey's name at the immortal gods for always allowing vice to triumph over virtue. How they laughed! Then he bellowed, and isn't it true, though Pompey says it? Deny it if you can, you damned fornicating dogs, you. And he flung the half-radish at them. The roar that went up. Never were there soldiers like Caesar's. Do you remember the song they sang at his French triumph? Home we bring the bald whoremonger, Romans, lock your wives away. Livy said, Pollio, my dear fellow, we were not discussing Caesar's morals, but the proper way to write history. Pollio said, yes, that's right. Our intelligent friend was criticizing your method under the respectful disguise of praising your readability. Boy, have you any further charges to bring against the noble Livy? I said, please, sir, don't make me blush. I admire Livy's work greatly. The truth, boy. Have you ever caught him out in any historical inaccuracies? You seem to be a fellow who reads a good deal. I would rather not venture. Oh, with it. Out with it. Out with it. There must be something. So I said, there is one thing that puzzles me, I confess. That is the story of Lars Porsena. According to Livy, Porsena failed to capture Rome, being first prevented by the heroic behavior of Horatius at the bridge, and then dismayed by the astounding daring of Scaevola. Livy relates that Scaevola, captured after an attempt at assassinating Porsena, thrust his hand into the flame on the altar and swore that 300 Romans like himself had bound themselves by an oath to take Porsena's life. And so Lars Porsena made peace. But I have seen the labyrinth tomb of Lars Porsena at Clusium, and there is a frieze on it of Romans emerging from the city gate and being led under a yoke. There's an Etruscan priest with a pair of shears cutting off the beards of the fathers. And even Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who was very favorably disposed towards us, states that the Senate voted Porsena an ivory throne, a scepter, a golden crown, and a triumphal robe, which can only mean that they paid him sovereign honors. So perhaps Lars Porsena did capture Rome in spite of Horatius and Scaevola. And Aaron's, the priest at Capua, he's supposed to be the last man who can read Etruscan inscriptions. Told me last summer that according to Etruscan records, the man who expelled the Tarquins from Rome was not Brutus, but Porsena, and that Brutus and Collatinus, the first two consuls at Rome, were merely the city stewards appointed to collect his taxes. Livy grew quite angry. I'm surprised at you, Claudius. Have you no reverence for Roman tradition, that you should believe the lies told by our ancient enemies to diminish our greatness? I only asked, I said humbly. What really happened then? Come on, Livy, said Pollio. Answer the young student. What really happened? Livy said, Another time. Let's keep to the matter in hand now, which is a general discussion of the proper way to write history. Claudius, my friend, you have ambitions that way. Which of us two old worthies will you choose as a model? You make it very difficult for the boy, you jealous fellows, put in Sulpicius. What do you expect him to answer? The truth will offend neither of us, answered Pollio. I looked from one face to the other. At last, I said, I think I would choose Pollio, as I am sure that I can never hope to attain Livy's inspired literary elegance. I shall do my best to imitate Pollio's accuracy and diligence. I looked from one face to the other. At last I said, I think I would choose Pollio, as I am sure that I can never hope to attain Livy's inspired literary elegance. I shall do my best to imitate Pollio's accuracy and diligence. Livy grunted and was about to walk off, but Pollio restrained him. Bottling down his glee as well as he could, he said, Come, Livy, you won't grudge me this one little disciple, will you? When you have them in regiments all over the world. Boy, did you ever hear about the old man from Cadiz? No, it's not dirty. In fact, it's rather sad. He came on foot to Rome. What to see? Not the temples, or the theaters, or the statues, or the crowds, or the shops, or the Senate House, but a man. What man? The man whose head is on the coins. No, a greater than he. He came to see none other than our friend Livy, whose works, it seems, he knew by heart. He saw him and saluted him and went straight back to Cadiz, where he immediately died. The disillusion and the long walk had been too much for him. Livy said, At any rate, my readers are genuine readers. Boy, do you know how Pollio has built up his reputation? Well, he's rich and has a very large, beautiful house and surprisingly good cook. He invites a great crowd of literary people to dinner, gives them a perfect meal, and afterwards casually picks up the latest volume of his history. He says humbly, Gentlemen, there are a few passages here that I am not quite sure about. I have worked very hard at them, but they still need the final polish, which I am counting on you to give them. By your leave. Then he begins to read. Nobody listens very carefully. Everyone's belly is stuffed. The cook's a genius. They are all thinking. The mullet with piquant sauce, and those fat stuffed thrushes, and the wild boar with truffles. When did I eat so well last? Not since Pollio last reading, I believe. Ah, here comes the slave with the wine again. That excellent Cyprian wine. Pollio's right. It's better than any Greek wine on the market. Meanwhile, Pollio's voice, and it's a nice voice to listen to, like a priest at evening sacrifice in summer, goes smoothly on, and every now and then he asks humbly, Is that all right, do you think? And everyone says, thinking of the thrushes again, or perhaps of the little simnel cakes, Admirable, admirable, Pollio. Now and then he will pause and ask, Now, which is the right word to use here? Shall I say that the returning envoys persuaded or excited this tribe to revolt. Or shall I say that the account they gave of the situation influenced the tribe in its decision to revolt? Actually, I think they gave an impartial account of what they had seen. Then a murmur goes up from the couches. Influenced polio. Used influenced. Thank you, friends, he says. You are very kind. Slave my penknife and pen. I'll change the sentence at once if you'll forgive me. Then he publishes the book and sends each of the diners a free copy. They say to their friends, chatting at the public baths, "Admirable book, this. Have you read it?" Polio's the greatest historian of our age, and not above asking advice in small points of style from men of taste either. Why, this word influenced, I gave him myself. Polio said, "That's right. My cook's too good. Next time I'll borrow yours and a few dozen bottles of your so-called Falernian wine, and I'll get really honest criticism." Sulpicius made a gesture of deprecation. Gentlemen, this is becoming personal." Livy was already going away, but Polio grinned at the retreating back and said in a loud voice, for his benefit, "A decent fellow, Livy is, but there's one thing wrong with him. It's a disease called paduanity." This made Livy stop and turn around. "What's wrong with Padua?" "I won't hear a word against the place." Polio explained to me. It's where he was born, you know. Somewhere in the northern provinces. There's a famous hot spring there of extraordinary properties. You can always tell a Paduan by bathing in the water of the spring or drinking it, and I'm told that they do both things simultaneously. Paduans are able to believe whatever they like, and believe it so strongly that they can make anyone else believe it. That's how the city got its such a wonderful commercial reputation. The blankets and rugs they make there are really no better than any other sort, in fact rather inferior, because the local sheep are yellow and coarse fleeced, but the Paduans, they are soft and white as goose feathers, and they have persuaded the rest of the world that it's so. I said, playing up to him, "Yellow sheep, that's a rarity. How do they get that color, sir?" "Why, by drinking the spring water. There's sulphur in it. All Paduans are yellow. Look at Livy." Livy came slowly towards us. "A joke is a joke, Polio, but I can take it in good part. But there's also a serious matter in question, and that is the proper writing of history. It may be that I have made mistakes. What historian is free from them? I have not at least told deliberate falsehoods. You'll not accuse me of that. Any legendary episode from early historical writings which bears on my theme of the ancient greatness of Rome, I gladly incorporate in the story. Though it may not be true in factual detail, it is true in spirit. If I come across two versions of the same episode, I choose the one nearest my theme, and you won't find me grubbing around Etruscan cemeteries in search of any third account, which may flatly contradict both. What good would that do?" "It would serve the cause of the truth," said Polio gently. "Wouldn't that be something? And if by serving the cause of truth we admit our revered ancestors to have been cowards, liars, and traitors, what then? I'll leave this boy to answer the question. He is just starting in life. Come on, boy, answer it." I said at random, "Livy begins his history by lamenting modern wickedness, and promising to trace the gradual decline of ancient virtues as conquest made Rome wealthy. He says that he will most enjoy writing the early chapters because he will be able, in doing so, to close his eyes to the wickedness of modern times. But in closing his eyes to modern wickedness, hasn't he sometimes closed his eyes to ancient wickedness as well?" "Well?" asked Livy, narrowing his eyes. "Well, I fumbled. Perhaps there isn't so much difference really between their wickedness and ours. It may be just a matter of scope and opportunity." Pollio said, "In fact, boy, the Paduan hasn't made you see his sulphur fleeces as snow white." I was very uncomfortable. "I have got more pleasure from reading Livy than from any other author," I repeated. "Oh, yes?" Pollio grinned. "That's just what the old man of Cadiz said. But like the old man of Cadiz, you feel a little disillusioned now, eh? Lars Porsena and Scaevola and Brutus and company stick in your throat?" "It's not disillusion, sir. I see now, though. I hadn't considered the matter before, and there are two different ways of writing history. One is to persuade men to virtue, and the other is to compel men to truth. The first is Livy's way, and the other is yours, and perhaps they are not irreconcilable." "Why, boy, you're an orator," said Pollio delightfully. Sulpicius, who had been standing on one leg with his foot held in his hand, as his habit was when excited or impatient, and twisting his beard in knots, now summed up. "Yes, Livy will never lack readers. People love being persuaded to ancient virtue by a charming writer, particularly when they are told in the same breath that modern civilization has made such virtue possible of attainment. But mere truth-tellers, undertakers who lay out the corpse of history, to quote poor Catulus's epigram on the noble Pollio, people who record no more than actually occurred, such men can only hold an audience while they have a good cook and a cellar of Cyprian wine." This made Livy really furious. He said, "Pollio, this talk is idle. Young Claudius here has always been considered dull-witted by his family and friends, and I didn't agree with the general verdict until today. You're welcome to your disciple, and Sulpicius can perfect his dullness. There's no better teacher of dullness in Rome than he gave us his Parthian shot. Et apud Apollinum istem Pollionis Pollictorum Diotissimi Polliet," which means, though the pun is lost in Greek, and may he flourish along at the shrine of the undertaker Apollo of Polios. Again, which means, though the pun is lost in Greek, and may he flourish long at the shrine of the undertaker Apollo of Polios. Then off he went, snorting. Pollio shouted cheerfully after him, "Quod certe pollicitor Pollio, pollac biliter, pollabit puer," which means, "Pollio promises you he will, the boy will flourish mightily." When we two were alone, Sulpicius having gone off to find a book, Pollio began questioning me. "Who are you, boy? Claudius is your name, isn't it? You obviously come of good family, but I don't know you." "I am Tiberius Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus." "My God, but Livy's right. You're supposed to be half-wit." "Yes, my family is ashamed of me because I stammer, and I'm lame and usually ill, so I go about very little in society. But dull-witted? You're one of the brightest young fellows I have met for years." "You are very kind, sir." "Not at all, by God. That was a nasty hit, that old Livy, about Lars Porsena. Livy has no conscience. That's the truth. I'm always catching him out. I asked him once if he always had the same trouble in finding the brass tablets he wanted among the litter of the Public Record Office. He said, 'Oh, no trouble at all,' and it turned out that he has never once been there to confirm a single fact. Tell me, why were you reading my history?" "I was reading your account of the siege of Perusia. My grandfather, Livia's first husband, you know, was there. I'm interested in that period, and I'm getting together materials for a life of my father. My tutor, Athenodorus, referred me to your book. He said it was honest. My former tutor, Marcus Porcius Cato, had once told me that it was a tissue of lies, so I was the more ready to believe Athenodorus." "Yes, Cato wouldn't like the book. The Catos fought on the wrong side. I helped to drive his grandfather out of Sicily. But I think you are the first youthful historian I have ever met. History is an old man's game. When are you going to win battles like your father and grandfather?" "Perhaps in my old age." He laughed. "I don't see why an historian who has made a life study of military tactics shouldn't be invincible as a commander, given good troops and courage." "And good staff officers," I put in, remembering Cleon. "And good staff officers, certainly, though he's never actually handled a sword or shield in his life." I was bold enough to ask Pollio why he was often called the last of the Romans. He looked pleased at the question and replied, "Augustus gave me that name. It was when he invited me to join him in his war against your grandfather, Antony. I asked him what sort of man he took me for. Antony had been one of my best friends, Asinius Pollio. He said, 'I believe that you're the last of the Romans. The title is wasted on that assassin Cassius.' 'And if I'm the last of the Romans,' I answered, 'whose fault is that? And whose fault will it be when you've destroyed Antony, that nobody but myself will ever dare hold his head up in your presence or speak out of turn?' 'Not mine, Asinius,' he said apologetically. 'It is Antony who has declared war, not I. And as soon as Antony is beaten, I shall, of course, restore republican government, if the lady Livia does not interpose her veto,' I said. The old man then took me by the shoulders. 'By the way, I'll tell you something, Claudius. I'm a very old man, and though I look brisk enough, I have reached the end. In 3 days I shall be dead, and I know it. Just before one dies, there comes a strange lucidity. One speaks prophetically. Now listen. Do you want to live a long, busy life with honor at the end of it?' 'Yes.' 'Then exaggerate your limp, stammer deliberately, sham sickness frequently. Let your wits wander, jerk your head, and twitch with your hands on all public or semi-public occasions. If you could see as much as I can see, you would know that this was your only hope of safety and eventual glory.' I said, 'Livy's story of Brutus, the first Brutus, I mean, may be unhistorical, but it's apt. Brutus pretended to be a half-wit too, but be better able to restore popular liberty.' 'What's that, popular liberty? You believe in that? I thought the phrase had died out among the younger generation.' 'My father and grandfather both believe in it.' 'Yes,' Pollio interrupted sharply. 'That's why they died.' 'What do you mean?' 'I mean that's why they were poisoned.' Poisoned? By whom?' Not so loud, boy. No, I'll not mention names, but I'll give you a sure token that I'm not just repeating groundless scandal. You're writing a life of your father, you say?' 'Yes.' 'Well, you'll see that you won't be allowed to get beyond a certain point in it. And the person who stops you?' Sulpicius came shuffling back at this point, and nothing more was said of any interest except when I took my leave of Pollio, and he drew me aside and muttered, 'Little Claudius, goodbye. But don't be a fool about popular liberty. That cannot come yet. Things must be far worse before they can be better. Then he raised his voice. And one thing more. If when I'm dead, you ever come across any important point in my histories that you find unhistorical, I give you permission. I'll stipulate that you have the authority to put the corrections in a supplement. Keep them up to date. Books, when they grow out of date, only serve as wrappings for fish. I said that this would be an honorable duty. 3 days later, Polio died. He left me in his will a collection of early Latin histories, but they were withheld from me. My uncle Tiberius said that it was a mistake, that they were intended for him, our names being so similar. His stipulation about my having the authority to make corrections everyone treated as a joke, but I kept my promise to Polio. Some 20 years later, I found that he had written very severely on the character of Cicero, a vain, vacillating, timorous fellow, and while not disagreeing with this verdict, I felt it necessary to point out that he was not a traitor too, as Polio had made him out. Polio was relying on some correspondence of Cicero's, which I was able to prove a forgery by Claudius Pulcher. Cicero had incurred Claudius's enmity by witnessing against him when he was accused of attending the sacrifice of the good goddess, disguised as a woman musician. This Claudius was another of the bad Claudians. Chapter 10. When I came of age, Tiberius had lately been ordered by Augustus to adopt Germanicus as his son, though he already had Castor as an heir, thus bringing him over from the Claudian into the Julian family. I now found myself head of the senior branch of the Claudians, and in indisputable possession, AD 6, of the money and estates inherited from my father. I became my mother's guardian, for she had never married again, which she felt as a humiliation. She treated me with rather more severity than before, though all business documents had to come to me for signature, and I was the family priest. My coming-of-age ceremony contrasted curiously with that of Germanicus. I put on my manly gown at midnight, and without any attendance or procession was carried into the capital in a sedan, where I sacrificed, and was then carried back to bed. Germanicus and Posthumus would have come, but in order to call as little attention to me as possible, Livia had arranged a banquet that night at the palace, which they could not be excused from attending. When I married Ergalanilla, the same sort of thing happened. Very few people were aware of her marriage until the day after it had been solemnized. There was nothing irregular about the ceremony. Ergalanilla's saffron-colored shoes and flame-colored veil, the taking of the auspices, the eating of holy cake, the 2 stools covered with sheepskin, the libation I poured, the anointing of her of the doorpost, the 3 coins, my present to her of fire and water. Everything was in order, except that the torchlight procession was omitted, and that the whole performance was carried through perfunctorily, and again. Everything was in order, except that the torchlight procession was omitted, and that the whole performance was carried through perfunctorily and hurriedly, and with bad grace. In order not to stumble over her husband's threshold the first time she enters a Roman bride, is always lifted over it. The two Claudians, who had to do the lifting, were both elderly men and unequal to Ergolanilla's weight. One of them slipped on the marble, and Ergolanilla came down with a bump, pulling them with her in a sprawling heap. There was no wedding omen worse than that, and yet it would be untrue to say that it turned out an unhappy marriage. There was not enough strain between us to justify the term unhappy. We slept together at first because that seemed expected of us, and even occasionally had sexual relations, my first experience of sex, because that too seemed part of marriage, and not from either lust or affection. I was always as considerate and courteous to her as possible, and she rewarded me by indifference, which was the best that I could hope from a woman of her character. She became pregnant 3 months after our marriage, and bore me a son called Drusillus, for whom I found it impossible to have any fatherly feeling. He took after my sister, Livilla, in spitefulness, and after Ergolanilla's brother, Plautius, in the rest of his character. Soon I shall tell you about Plautius, who was my moral exemplar and paragon, appointed by Augustus. Augustus and Livia had a methodical habit of never coming to any decision on any important matter relating to the family or state without recording in writing both the decision and deliberations that led up to it, usually in the form of letters exchanged between each other. From the mass of correspondence left behind them on their deaths, I have made transcripts of several which illustrate Augustus's attitude to me at this time. My first extract is dated 3 years before my marriage. My dear Livia, I wish to put on record a strange thing that happened today. I hardly know what to make of it. I was talking to Athenodorus, and happened to say to him, I fear that tutoring young Tiberius Claudius must be rather a weary task. He seems to me to grow daily more miserable-looking and nervous and incapable. Athenodorus said, Don't judge the boy too harshly. He feels most keenly the family's disappointment in him and the slights that he everywhere meets. But he's very far from incapable, and believe it or not, I get great pleasure from his society. You never heard him declaim, did you? Declaim? I said, laughing. Yes, declaim, Athenodorus repeated. Now let me make a suggestion. You set a subject for declamation, and in half an hour's time come and hear what he makes of it. But hide behind a curtain, or you'll hear nothing worth listening to. I set for a subject Roman conquest in Germany, and listening half an hour later behind that curtain, I have never been so astonished before in my life. He had his facts at his fingers' ends, his main headings were well chosen, and his detail set in proper relation and proportion to them. More than this, his voice was under control, and he did not stammer. God strike me dead if it wasn't positively pleasant and instructive to listen to him. But how a fellow whose daily conversation is so hopelessly foolish can make a set speech, at short notice, too, in so perfectly rational and even learned a style is beyond me. I slipped away telling Athenodorus not to mention that I had been there, or how surprised I had been, but feel obliged to tell you of the matter, and even to suggest that we might henceforth occasionally allow him to dine with us at night, when there are few guests there, on the understanding that he keeps his mouth shut and his ears open. If there is, after all, as I am inclined to think, some hope that he will eventually turn out a reasonable member of the family, he ought to be gradually accustomed to mix with his social equals. We can't keep him shut away with his tutors and freedom forever. There is, of course, great division of opinion on the question of his mental capacities. His uncle Tiberius, his mother Antonia, and his sister Livilla are unanimous in regarding him as an idiot. On the other side, Athenodorus, Sulpicius, Posthumus and Germanicus swear that he's as sensible when he wishes as any man, but that he's easily put off his balance by nervousness. As for myself, I repeat that I cannot make up my mind on the matter yet." To which Livia replied, "My dear Augustus, the surprise that you had behind that curtain was no greater and no less than the surprise we once had when the Indian ambassador took the silk cloth off the gold cage which his master the High King had sent us, and we saw the bird parrot for the first time with his emerald feathers and ruby necklet, and heard him say, 'Hail Caesar, father of country!' It was not the remarkableness of the phrase, for any little lip-singing child can say as much, but that a bird spoke. It astonished us. And nobody but a fool would praise Parrot for his wit in coming out with the appropriate words, for he did not know the meaning of any one of them. The credit goes to the man who trained the bird, by incredible patience, to repeat the phrase, for as you know, on other occasions he is trained to say other things, and in general conversation he talks the most arrant nonsense, and we have to keep his cage covered to silence him. So with Claudius, though it is hardly complimentary to Parrot, an undeniably handsome bird, to compare my grandson to him. What you heard was without the least doubt a speech that he had happened to learn by heart. After all, Roman conquest in Germany is a very obvious subject, and Athenodorus may well have him word perfect in half a dozen or more model declamations of the same sort. Mind you, I don't say that I'm not pleased to hear that he is so amenable to training. I am extremely pleased. It means, for instance, that we shall be able to coach him through his marriage ceremony. But your suggestion about the supping with us is ridiculous. I refuse ever to eat in the same room as that fellow. It would give me indigestion. As for the testimony in favor of his mental soundness, examine it. Germanicus, as a child, swore to his dying father to love and protect his infant brother. You know Germanicus's nobility of soul, and that rather than betray this sacred trust, he would make out the best case possible for his brother's wits, hoping that they might happen one day to improve. It is equally clear why Athenodorus and Sulpicius pretend to consider him improvable. They are very well paid to improve him, and their appointments give them an excuse for hanging about the palace and giving themselves airs as privy councillors. As for Posthumus, I have been complaining now for some months past, haven't I, that I cannot understand that young man at all. I consider that death has been extremely unkind to take off his two talented brothers and leave us only him. He delights in starting an argument with his seniors, where no argument is necessary, the facts being clearly beyond dispute, merely to exasperate us and show his own importance as your single surviving grandson. His championship of Claudius's intelligence is a case in point. He was positively insolent to me the other day when I happened to remark that Sulpicius was wasting his time in tutoring the boy. He actually said that, in his opinion, Claudius had more penetration than most of his immediate relatives, which I suppose was intended to include me. But Posthumus is another problem. For the moment, the question is about Claudius, and I cannot, I repeat, have him dining in my company, for physical reasons which I hope you will appreciate. Livia. He wrote to Livia a year later, when she was away for a few days in the country. As for young Claudius, I shall take the advantage of your absence to invite him to supper every night. I admit that his presence still embarrasses me, but I do not think it good for him always to sup alone with his Sulpicius and Athenodorus. The talk he has with them is too purely bookish, and, excellent fellows though they both are, They are not ideal companions for a boy of his age and station. I do sincerely wish that he would choose some young man of rank on whose bearing and dress and behavior he may model his own. But his timidity and diffidence prevent this. He has a hero worship for our dear Germanicus, which he feels his own shortcomings so keenly that he would no more dare to imitate him than I would go about in lion's skin, and club and call myself Hercules. The poor creature is unfortunate, for in matters of importance, when his mind is not wool-gathering, the nobility of his heart is clearly shown. A third letter, written shortly after my marriage, when I had just been nominated as a priest of Mars, is also of interest. My dear Livia, as you advised me, I have discussed with our Tiberius that what we are to do about young Claudius when these games in honor of Mars are held. Now that he has come of age and been appointed to the vacancy in the college of the priest of Mars, we cannot put off our decision with regard to his future much longer. We agree about that, do we not? If he is sufficiently sound in mind and body to be eventually recognized as a reputable member of the family, as I believe he is, or I would not have adopted both Tiberius and Germanicus and left him as head of the senior branch of the Claudian house, then obviously he should be taken in hand and given the same opportunities for advancement as Germanicus. I admit that I may still be mistaken. His recent improvement has not been striking. But if we decide that, after all, the infirmities of his bodies are bound up with the settled infirmity of mine, we must not give malicious people a chance of making fun of him and us. I repeat, we must decide pretty quickly once and for all about the lad. If only because we would find it a continual trouble and embarrassment if we had to decide afresh on every occasion that presented itself whether or not we considered him able to undertake those duties of state for which his birth befits him. Well, the immediate question is, what to do about him at these games? I would have no objection to his being put in charge of the priest mess room, but on the strict understanding that he leaves everything to his brother-in-law, young Plautius Silvanus, and merely does what he is told. He could learn a good deal in this way, and there is no reason for him to disgrace himself if he learns his lesson well. But of course, it is out of the question for him to sit with me in the president's box, along with the sacred statue, for everybody in the theater will constantly be looking in that direction, and any oddities in his behavior will be commented upon. Another problem is what to do with him at the Latin festival. Germanicus is going to the Alban Hill with the consuls to take part in the sacrifice, and Claudius wishes, I understand, to go with him. But there again I am not sure whether he can be trusted not to make a fool of himself. Germanicus will be busy with his duties and unable to look after him all the time. And if he does go, people will want to know what he's doing there in any case. They will ask why we have not appointed him to act as city warden at Rome, or for the duration of the festival, in the absence of the magistrates, an honor which you will recall we have granted in turn to Gaius Lucius Germanicus, young Tiberius, and Postumus, as soon as they came of age, as their first taste of office. The best way out of the difficulty is to report him sick, because of course the city wardenship is out of the question for him. If you care to show Antonia this letter, I have no objection. Assure her that we shall soon decide one way or the other about her son. It is an incongruous position for her to be legally under his guardianship. Augustus. Except that it was my first public duty, there is nothing remarkable to record about my management of the priest's mess. Plautius, a vain, natty little cock-sparrow of a man, did all the work for me, and did not even trouble to explain the catering system and the rules of priestly procedure, even refused to answer my questions about such matters. All he did was to drill me in certain formal gestures and phrases, which I was to use on welcoming the priest, and at various stages of the meal, and forbade me to say another word. This was extremely uncomfortable for me, because frequently I could have taken a useful part in the conversation, and my dumbness and subservience to Claudius gave a bad impression. The games themselves I did not see. You will have noticed Livia's disparaging remarks about Posthumus. From this time on, they grow more and more frequent in her letters, and Augustus, though at first he tries to stand up for his grandson, gradually admits disappointment in him. I think that Livia must have told Augustus a good deal more than appears in their correspondence, for Posthumus to have fortified his favor so easily. But certain definite things appear. First, Tiberius is reported by Livia as complaining of an impudent reference by Posthumus to the University of Rhodes. Then Cato is reported by her as complaining of Posthumus's bad influence on the younger scholars in defying his discipline. Then Livia produces Cato's confidential reports, saying that she has held them back so long in hope of a change. Next come worried references to his moroseness and sullenness. This was the time of Posthumus's disappointment over Livilla, and his grief for the death of his brother Gaius. Then there is the recommendation, when he comes of age, that the whole of his inheritance from his father Agrippa shall not be made over to him for a few years, because that might give him opportunities for even greater profligacy than he now indulges in. When he is enrolled among the young men of military age, he is posted to the guards as a simple staff lieutenant, and given none of the extraordinary honors awarded to Gaius and Lucius. Augustus himself is of the opinion that this is the safest course to take, for Posthumus is ambitious. The same sort of uncomfortable situation must not arise as when the young nobles supported Marcellus against Agrippa or Gaius against Tiberius. Soon we read that Posthumus takes this ill, telling Augustus that he does not want the honors on their own account, but that their being withheld has been misinterpreted by his friends, who believe him under a cloud at the palace. Then follow more serious notes. Posthumus has lost his temper with Claudius, but neither of the two will tell Livia later what the circumstances of their quarrel were, and has picked him up and thrown him into a fountain in the presence of several men of rank and their lackeys. He is then called to account by Augustus, and shows no contrition, insisting that Plautius deserved his ducking for speaking in an insulting way to me. At the same time, he complains to Augustus that his inheritance is being unjustly withheld. Soon he is reprimanded by Livia for his changed manner and for his surliness towards her. "What's poisoned you?" she asks. He replies, grinning, "Maybe you've been putting something in my soup." When she demands an explanation of this extraordinary joke, he replies, grinning still more vulgarly, "Putting things in soup is an old trick among stepmothers." Augustus soon after this has a complaint from Posthumus's general that he does not mix with the other young officers, but spends all his leisure time at the sea, fishing. He has earned the nickname Neptune for this. My duties as priest of Mars were not arduous, and Plautius, who was a priest of the same college, was detailed to watch me whenever there was a ceremony. I was coming to hate Plautius. The insulting remark for which Posthumus had thrown him into the fountain was one of many. He had called me a lemur, and said that it was only loyalty to Augustus and Livia that prevented him from spitting at me every time I asked him foolish and superfluous questions.